Bernardo. I am Professor of Control Theory at the University of Naples, Federico II, and I am also coordinator of the research program in Risk and Complexity of the Scuola Superiore Meridionale, the new school for advanced studies here in Naples, the University of Naples. So I would like to thank you all for being here and welcome you to the 34th edition of Futuro Remoto. Futuro Remoto is the oldest science festival in Europe. It was started by Città della Scienza back in 1987, and it sees this year a lot of different events, over 350 different events with 22 international appointments, happenings, and over 6 exhibitions. This year edition is devoted to the planet Earth and global challenges we are facing, the epochal changes that we have to tackle and we have to address at the global level. And today, I'm really honored to host this event, which is a talk with Professor Saul Perlmutter, who received the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2011. He's a world-renowned scientist. We are really honored to have him here. And he will talk about a very important topic, which is the role of scientific critical thinking and the role that this kind of thinking and approach can have, even if you're not a scientist, in facing and contrasting disinformation. We have heard a lot in these years and in this time of pandemic about the fake news, disinformation, and so on. And so he will give us his view and a very interesting talk on how to build a credible shared sense of the real complex world we live in. This event, I should mention, is possible thanks to the collaboration of Città della Scienza with the Exploratorium Museum of San Francisco. And I would like also to acknowledge the fantastic work of all the team behind Futuro Remoto. In particular, I had the opportunity to work with Anne-Marie Bruyas, Michaela Riccio, and Daniele Lubrano, who is in charge of the technical services. I would also like to acknowledge the support of the PhD office of the University of Naples, Federico II, and in particular, the head of the office, Concetta Bernardo, and Dr. Anna Russo, who is in charge of internationalization, who helped us to advertise this event broadly to a vast audience of PhD students from all over the country. So without any further ado, I would like to end this brief introduction by inviting to the virtual stage Professor Matteo Lorito, Director of the University of Naples Federico II, for his welcome address. Matteo?
Yes, I'm here. I hope you can hear me and see me well.
Yes, thank you, Matteo. We can hear you.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to introduce this event tonight. Of course, my first thanks goes to our special guest, Professor Perlmutter, that is giving us an important lecture. Of course, this is a great opportunity for us, also for our PhD students, which we have gathered together. Thank you to Futuro Remoto. This Futuro Remoto is for us here to see. You see, as a very, very important meeting that we do every year. It's a way to connect people, the way to connect scientists of different vision and different natural disciplines. So it's extremely important. I understand that the topic of tonight is how to develop a culture of science, or how to transfer to people that are not used to use the scientific method, the way of thinking like a scientist, the way of approaching reality and you know what's happening around us like a scientist. So evaluating and believing something only when you have proof of concept and so on. They're all things that for us that we used to be a scientist are normal, but not for normal people. You see, normal people, they tend to do two things: either to trust scientists, they don't understand why, but they do trust scientists, or the other way to do it is to understand why to trust scientists. And I believe that now we are in a phase at the end of this pandemic where the people, they want also to understand how and why they need to trust scientists. And also because really we will see in the next future science and and research really been central to the life of people. People today, they turn on TV at night and they find scientists all over the place, which was not the same thing before the pandemics. And so they ask themselves, who should we trust and what these guys are saying and what we should do. But this is important. So there's an opportunity for science really to have a social impact. And this goes, I think, to what big university like the one I represent, I have the honor to represent, which is the University of Naples Federico II, just for people that don't know about us, which is the largest university in the south of Italy, the second in the country for size and dimension, 80,000 students, 26 departments, and so on, to really go well beyond our traditional mission, which is the teaching and doing research and transfer technology. We do have a social responsibility today. It is very important also, and I'm talking to all the young people connected that will listen to your talk. It's really important for the young scientists to understand that today they have a social responsibility. Not only doing science, not only understanding science, not only producing research, not only looking at the H index or whatever or the impact factor, but they also have the responsibility now to transfer their ability to see the world, to critically, evaluate the information to the people around us. And this is very important. So we are very much involved in this. We very much all these ideas and Futuro Remoto with events like this one, they're really helpful for us. So thank you very much for being with us tonight. We'll really look forward to hear from you. And of course, you're a big name. And so we're really looking how you have approached this, the issue of also transferring complicated disciplines, which I understand you're studying, also to other scientists, the people that want to understand what you're doing and what you're producing. Thank you very much. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for your kind words. Next, we are honored to have online Miss Mary Avery, the U.S. General Consul in Naples, whom I would like to invite on the virtual stage to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Professor Di Bernardo. And good evening. I am Mary Avery, the U.S. Consul General in Naples. It's my pleasure to be able to join you all virtually this evening. I would like to thank the organizers of this online edition of the prestigious science festival, Futuro Remoto, and in particular, the president of Città della Scienza, Dr. Riccardo Villari, and the president of the scientific committee, Professor Luigi Nicolais, who invited me today. I also would like to take this opportunity to greet the esteemed Professor Lorito, Rector of the University of Naples, Federico II, another strong partner of the U.S. Consulate General in Naples. And I would also like to greet Professor Saul Perlmutter. I'm honored to introduce him to all of you today. Currently, Professor Perlmutter teaches physics at the University of California at Berkeley, and he has numerous accomplishments, including receiving the Nobel Prize in 2011 for his outstanding work on the accelerating expansion of the universe. Professor Perlmutter is also the director of the Berkeley Institute of Data Science and of the Berkeley Center for Cosmological Physics. All very difficult fields, I'm sure, to explain to the layperson, which is why it's so important that he's here to speak with us tonight. He is one of the most brilliant minds of our times, and he has developed these courses that seek to teach scientific-style critical thinking to scientists and non-scientists alike. We are incredibly grateful for his time today to represent the United States, given his many contributions to the sciences and other related fields worldwide. This is an incredibly difficult time for all of us. The global pandemic poses unprecedented challenges, and we must discover new reserves of resilience to be able to take action. Città della Scienza has displayed such resilience as well as courage and ingenuity by organizing an amazing event that celebrates the importance of science and innovation in our society, utilizing technology to connect us today. Although I'm saddened that we can't meet in person for this festival this year, I am pleased to participate in this online edition, one of the many gifts that today's technology has given us is the possibility of being together virtually, even if we are distant geographically. So the U.S. Consulate General and Città della Scienza are long-term friends and partners, and we are happy to renew this partnership again this year based on our shared interest to further U.S.-Italy collaboration in science, technology, engineering, and math. We believe in the fundamental role of these STEM fields in our time, as well as in the future, and in particular for the youth of today who will become the leaders of tomorrow. My hope is that an ever-growing audience of Americans and Italians will be able to participate in Futuro Remoto's virtual events and be inspired by the words of both our country's illustrious experts. Buon Futuro Remoto 2020 a tutti. Now I pass the floor to Professor Perlmutter. Grazie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words. Just before passing the word to Professor Perlmutter, I just wanted to remind participants that after the talk, it will be possible to ask questions. If you wish to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand in Teams and type the question in the chat. I will then pick a selection of questions, and if possible, I will pass you the word if our technical means allows, or I will read the question for you to Professor Perlmutter. So, without any further ado, let me thank again Professor Perlmutter for being with us today, and I leave the virtual stage over to him. Thank you.
Well, first, a good morning and a good evening to different parts of the world, and it's a pleasure to join you virtually. And I will say that I missed the opportunity to be there in person. It's been a while since I was last visiting Naples, and I had not had a chance to see all the new science that's being done there for a while. So I look forward to the time that we can all meet in person, and as well as everybody who's in the audience, that we get a chance to talk. Today, my goal is to actually start a conversation. And I know it's a little bit odd to do this in some ways virtually, but in other ways it means more of us can participate. And so I'm very much hoping is to set a number of ideas forward. And I don't think that this is a finished story, and it will probably never be a finished story. But what I want is to begin us thinking about a way in which we might approach some of these problems that we face in the world today. So let me see. So maybe I should begin with my slides if they're available. There we go. So, well, while these slides are starting, I'll just say a few more words about what I want to discuss is something which I think almost all of us have become very aware of during the last few years, and particularly during this year of the pandemic. And I somewhat grandiosely describe this as an educational proposal to save the world in this slide. But as you'll see, I think it's relevant to almost everything that we worry about today. So ordinarily, when I give talks, I would be giving a talk about the state of the universe and the expansion of the universe. And so some other day I will come back, and for those who are curious, I will be glad to tell you all about how the universe is doing in its acceleration. But what I want to talk about today, of course, is that we more locally have some problems with our understanding of the immediate world we live in, not just the larger universe that we live in. And these you can see this difficulty with understanding showing up in a number of different ways. I think many of you are probably aware of the fact that there's a lot of doubt about the vaccinations that we think are going to be coming online. And because people are uncomfortable with understanding what to trust and what not to trust, it means that a large number of people will find it difficult to take the vaccination. And of course, that undercuts the whole idea that could end the pandemic. And there's very odd interactions with the understanding of what is real out there in the universe that are highlighted during the pandemic. So, for example, I am told that there are these conspiracy theories that have been spread about the connection between the 5G cell phone technology and COVID-19. And this seems somewhat crazy, and yet apparently there have been attacks on the cell phone masts in countries that I ordinarily think of as being very civilized, UK and the Netherlands. So why is it that we are having such a hard time identifying what is the reality here? It's clear that this is the pandemic. Then is not just a crisis of scientific knowledge, but clearly people are having a very hard time making decisions and group decisions in this world with uncertainty about the facts. In general, my feeling is that our societies are little by little becoming more and more polarized and having a harder and harder time making rational decisions in this particular way. And in some sense, it's all of the major worries of our time: the pandemics and disease, poverty and justice, the big questions of climate change, biodiversity loss, nuclear weapons. All of these issues are issues where we need to find answers together as a group. And in every case, we're held up by the fact that we have a hard time making rational decisions together. And to turn the story in the positive sense, I'm personally quite optimistic that if we do a better job finding the ways to make decisions together in a rational way, then I'm not actually that worried about all of these terrible existential threats. I think that humans are amazingly capable, and that when we are all working on the same page, when we're all working together, we can solve almost any of these, any problem that I can imagine. And I think these problems are exactly the kinds of problems that we would be good at if we were working together. So it's, in the end, I see this as not just the problems are the greatest challenges of our generation, but the problems involving how do we work together to solve problems, those seem to be the greatest challenges of our generation. And if we can handle those, then I'm very optimistic, and I think that's why we need to work on these very directly. So let me comment that it's clear that the problem today is not that we're missing information. There's a deluge of information. We can find almost any information that we need. The problem is that we have to be able to identify what information is credible and which expertise is credible. And that's really what I would want to be discussing today. Now, in my own field, before I go there, I'll just comment that what I would like to propose today is that scientific critical thinking is something that is not taught the same way that science content is taught. So in most schools, people will be offered physics and chemistry and biology, but they're not offered the underlying scientific approach that's used in all the sciences. And so in that sense, I think it's maybe the most underutilized offering of a science education. And I believe that that's actually something that could make a very big difference here. Now, in my own field, I'm often looking at these understandings of the universe that we develop. So these questions of what's happening when the universe is expanding, and is it actually speeding up in its expansion as we seem to be finding, and what could possibly be causing it? And at times you have to step back and you have to ask yourself, well, is this real? Are all these elements and concepts that we're working with, do they really represent something that's actually happening out there in the world? And I think it's one of the more fun aspects of working in a project like this, that you are trying to understand something that's really happening out there using just the little bits of information that you have available to you. And so you're constantly facing those kinds of questions of what is reality in this kind of work. But what I think is interesting is that the issues of credibility of what's going on there out in the world, what I call credibility. I'm using the term web just to represent our current access to what is going on out in the world, has a lot of similarity to the issues of the credibility of our picture of scientific reality. And in both cases, the ways that we get our sense of understanding of what is really going on out there can be quite similar. So in both cases, there's a tendency for us to look for famous authorities to tell us what's really going on out there, what is the truth of the reality, and also tendencies to look for, where are there indications of popularity? What do most people think is the real truth of what's going on out there? Now, those are not always wrong. Many times they're quite useful. But when it comes down to it, we don't want Aristotle to be our last word in physics. We want to be able to go beyond Aristotle, and we certainly don't want to be using whatever the fashionable rumors are about medical treatment as our source of information about medical treatment. And so we certainly need something more than these. Science has had this same problem going back for centuries. I call it the problem of practical epistemology. And the way that science has dealt with it over the centuries, I think, is very informative here. First, it's developed some methodologies in the years since the Enlightenment, but it's accelerated in methodology in these approaches even into the recent centuries, into the recent decades. We're still developing methodology that allows us to get at this problem of what to believe about the world out there, and how not to be fooled by what some random person tells you is going on out there. Now, many of us were taught something in school that was called the scientific method, but my understanding of this is that we don't really have a single approach that we call this, that's really the scientific method. It's more of a whole culture and a whole set of methodological tricks and approaches, as I say here. And it's that vocabulary of ideas that we really use to achieve this goal. All these approaches are held together by some common themes, and so I think maybe one of the most important ones is the fact that we tend to fool ourselves. We're very good at fooling ourselves, and so we need structures to help us recognize when we're fooling ourselves about the world out there. In general, we have all sorts of mental strengths and weaknesses, and so we need tools that will help us play to our strengths, but also to suppress our weaknesses in understanding the world. And then finally, these tools all assume something that is I think crucial in all this, that there is a reality out there that we're trying to get in touch with, and that we connect with it imperfectly, but our job is to get closer and closer to it over time. And so these hold together some of these tools that we're describing. Now, I believe that all these same approaches that we use to understand the physical world and the world out there as scientists are all highly relevant when we try to understand the reality of the world out there through the web that we are all faced with today. And I think we want to be in a position to take advantage of these tools. So what do these tools look like? What is this collection of ideas that I call scientific culture? Well, about 8 years ago, I sat down with faculty in several other fields. So I decided that physics was not enough by itself. So I found a social psychologist in the public policy school at Berkeley, and a philosophy professor, and we put together a session with students from all around the university, and we would be meeting once a week and trying to figure out what would be the best way to articulate these tools and approaches that science has offered us, and what would be the minimum set of ideas that might help people understand how to approach the world. And so this led to this course that we ended up calling Sense and Sensibility and Science. And these my colleagues who I've worked with it over the years and I'll just mention that it's been a real pleasure working with them and with the Berkeley students in finding ways to capture these different ideas that I think together make a bit of a culture that allows us to understand the world together. So what I'm going to do today, as just a way to start the conversation going, is I want to describe to you a number of the ideas that we decided that needed to be taught in this class. And we've grouped them. Well, that's interesting. The PowerPoint seems to have been damaged here, so I apologize. So we grouped them into these. There are about 24 concepts that we developed that we want to teach in this course. We grouped them into 6 approximate groupings of ideas. And I won't obviously have time to go through all 24 concepts today. At some point, if you're curious, I'll point you to where to look for it on the web. But what I want to do is give a feel for the kinds of ideas that we felt were so important to be able to teach in this. So let me just begin walking through what some of these elements look like. First, let me describe some of the what I call the underpinnings. These are some of the philosophical underpinnings that make a lot of the other discussion possible. The first one is one that I've already mentioned to you, the idea that we live in a world where we have to share a common objective reality that's out there that we want to understand. And this is as contrasted to a socially constructed reality where each of us and each group has developed their own picture of a world out there, and there's no reason to talk to each other because each of those pictures is separate and different, and it's so pointless to have a conversation about, well, my reality looks like this. Oh, well, your reality looks like that. Well, okay, they're just different. I think science has made its progress by not accepting a social construction of reality as the goal, but a shared objective reality where all of us actually have to just talk to each other to figure out what is going on out there, not what is going on in our own minds. Now, that doesn't mean that we get it right, and it doesn't mean that our brains necessarily are capable at any moment of understanding everything about the world out there. It's just that it's understood that that's the goal, and that's what we're trying to find together. This kind of idea then has led to these metaphors for what knowledge involves, and so one of the things we discuss is the difference between a pyramid metaphor and a raft metaphor for knowledge. And I think many people have grown up with the idea that science is based on a bit of a pyramid metaphor, where you have the deep underpinnings in the foundation, and those have to be very, very solid because then you're going to build stones of knowledge on top of those, and then further on top of that, and that knowledge is this construct built up from the bottom, and that if at any point it turned out that one of our foundational ideas was wrong, the whole thing would collapse, and we'd have to start over again. That, I'd say, is not the picture of knowledge that we actually work with as scientists usually. The metaphor that I think that is much closer to the way we really think about it is the raft metaphor, where you have a raft of knowledge where there are many bits and pieces of ideas and information and theory that are all, each of them woven together in, each one is like a different stick that's woven together into a raft. And the whole thing together has to be coherent enough to be able to float and give us some understanding of reality. But if at any time one of those sticks turns out to be wrong, we have to be very capable of taking that stick out and putting a different correction stick in, and then having a raft that still floats at any given moment, but is built out of slightly different material. This is part of the way in which we understand ourselves, our world, so that we don't feel locked into any particular part of our theoretical story, but we're able to update and change as we learn something new. And it's interesting that even something as deeply fundamental as our theory of gravity that we've had since the time of Newton, when we learn from Einstein that it's a good approximation, but it's not quite the whole theory, we're able to appropriately take the sticks out and put new sticks in, and yet nobody questions that we haven't built a very strong and useful raft all that time. All right, so so these are a couple of examples of some of the philosophical underpinnings that we've discussed. Perhaps even more obvious to many people is the fact that we need to be able to talk about causal connections. And so we have to be able to differentiate for people the difference between something that happens at the same time something else happens, that things are correlated and associated. And we have to be able to distinguish the cases in which that's just both caused by something else, or when one causes the other, or when the first causes one. And so in a course like this, we start to discuss situations in which you can experiment, in which you can, let's say, hold many of the possible variables fixed while you change one variable, and so you can look to see which of those are actually the causal connections and which ones are the effect. During this last year, the pandemic, of course, we've gotten very used to hearing these discussions of causal connections, and particularly when people talk about all the decisions about vaccinations, where you start hearing about the randomized controlled studies that are used to establish when we're seeing a causal relationship between taking a drug or a vaccination and the outcome that you want, and when it's just a random association that, oh, it looked like when people took this drug they seemed to get better, but it turned out that was they could have gotten better anyway. So I think I'm having a more detailed discussion of when we can identify correlation versus causation is a very important part of this work and a part of this vocabulary. I will say that that people sometimes think that the only way that you can establish causation is by doing a full randomized controlled study the way you do in these medical examples. But I have to describe to them that there are other causal techniques that you use as well. In my own field, for example, in cosmology, we don't really get to do randomized control studies. It's very hard for us to select a certain number of galaxies and treat them one way, and then have a random set that we treat another way and see what happens. And yet we still have to be able to establish causality. And so we discuss mechanisms by which you can identify causal connections, even when you cannot do a carefully controlled experiment. So these are some of the philosophical underpinnings. Let me turn next to the very important area of probabilistic and statistical thinking that I want to discuss. Now, some of this would be recognized by from somebody who might have taken a statistics course at some point. But for the purpose of this course, we don't want people to be treating statistics as this body of recipes and knowledge that is taught in a statistics course. Instead, what we really want to do is we want to get people comfortable with what the problems are that we face as humans that makes us go take a statistics course. So what's the underlying issue that creates the reason for somebody to invent statistics as a field? Some of the examples that we discuss include the fact that we're often in a position of trying to pull out some signal from noise. We're trying to find, what is actually an indicator of what's causing, let's say, a transmission of disease right during this year, versus all the other things that are happening at the same time that it's very hard to tell apart which thing is causing the problem. So pulling out a signal from noise and finding these patterns in noise is a very big part of what we're doing when we're trying to understand the world outside. But it comes along with a danger, which is that humans are quite good at seeing patterns when they're there, but they're also very good at imagining that they see a pattern when it's just random. It's like the flip of a coin, and if you flip the coin multiple times, eventually you'll see patterns like multiple heads in a row. And of course, our brains are fast to think that we now see what's going on here. But in fact, often we fool ourselves. And in fact, one of the biggest jobs as a scientist is to be able to recognize when you're seeing just the coincidence of random noise that looks like it's an important pattern that you should know, that it's really telling you that this particular behavior is causing the transmission of the pandemic, versus where no, that's just coincidental that you happen to see that behavior and these people happen to also be getting sick. So what we've invented as science over the years is the tools of statistics in order to capture and to tell apart what the odds are that something will happen randomly and what the odds are that this is actually a true effect. And I think that's a very helpful for people to recognize this style of thinking that allows you to be aware of the way you might fool yourself, and yet also aware that there are ways to avoid fooling yourself in this. Now, maybe even more important in terms of probabilistic thinking is just the idea that almost any proposition we hold, almost any idea statement that we make, with the scientific culture, you say it with a certain degree of tentativeness. And in fact, you often quantify how tentative your statement is. So you may be very sure of something, in which case you could be 99% confident. In fact, you could be so sure that something is likely to be true that you give it 99.999999% confidence. You'd bet your life on it. But at the same time, you understand that almost any proposition you state, including this very proposition itself, you hold with a bit of tentativeness, an understanding that it could turn out to be wrong in some way or other. And this is very important because you need, if you're really going to understand the world and you're going to take seriously this job of recognizing the objective reality out there, you have to be open to being wrong, and that you have to be constantly looking for in what ways you might be wrong in any given situation. So this approach and this style, I think, has been a very important one for scientific thinking over the years. And in order to help the students understand it, we've ended up trying to develop, in fact, every one of the concepts that we teach in this course, we try to figure out ways to teach it with some experiential activity, some way in which you can practice the idea so that you feel you build it more deeply into your worldview, and then you can see it in the world around you, no matter where it shows up. So in this particular case, we invented a game that we play in the class, and the idea of this particular game is that you ask the students in small groups to choose a topic to discuss, and in this case, we gave them the topic: has the increased use of standardized testing in the U.S. elementary schools improved the quality of education or made it worse? And they start having a discussion about this, and they argue back and forth about it. But what's different is that during that discussion, every time they make a statement that could have some truth or lack of truth, they have to also give a number from 0 to 100 of how confident they are that statement is correct. And they interrupt each other and stop each other in the conversation if somebody forgets to say their number. So you get quotes like this. You say that most teachers have now begun to teach what they think will be on the test rather than what they think is the most important material to be teaching, 82. And of course that number is supposed to indicate their confidence in that statement when they get to it. What's interesting is that after they have this conversation and this discussion in that style, we asked them, okay, what was your experience with it? And interestingly, people report that they find it makes them aware, first of all, that they're much less confident and sure of facts that they're using in their argument than they might have thought. And so they realized that they were only 82% confident of this idea, even though they were going to say it very definitively in the conversation. And already that made the conversation a little bit richer because it made them realize that it was possible that they were wrong in certain parts of the argument. They also said that having said that number, it made them have to consider the alternative a little bit more. They realized, well, if it's only 82% likely this is true, what would I think about that whole argument if the other 18% of the probability turned out to be the truth? And having that ability to think about the problem in this way, that what would happen if the things I thought were right turned out to be wrong, also made a much more interesting conversation. So I think that this is a key part of how science thinking works, to hold propositions with a little bit of tentativeness so that you can update and you can change your mind when necessary. But I think it's also a key part of how we should be approaching all our understanding of the facts of what's reality out there in the world. So the first two groups of concepts I mentioned to you both come along with a lot of the skepticism and doubt that you need to have when you approach the world, to be able to recognize how you could be wrong. But this third group of topics, what I call the can-do aspects of science, is something which comes where all your skepticism and doubt could be the brakes that stop you from making too many mistakes, but you also need the accelerator pedal to move forward and make progress in the world. And one of the, I think, perhaps under-recognized aspects of science that's worth articulating and worth talking about is this can-do aspect that I'm describing. I sometimes begin with one of the topics that we teach is this concept I call scientific optimism. And I introduce it often by asking people to the simple question: what is the second longest time that you ever spent trying to solve a puzzle? And we offer them less than an hour, less than a day, less than a month, less than a year, or more than a year. And I even ask everybody right now who's on this call to just think about this for a second. What would you choose, A, B, C, D, or E here in this in this choice? And I should emphasize I use the second longest time that you ever tried to solve a puzzle, because I want not the one moment that you got obsessed with a puzzle, but more typically, what would be the amount of time you would devote to some problem of this kind. And maybe I pause for a second and ask, just so you can think about it. What really is the second longest time that you spent? I will say that when I ask this in the class, when we're teaching this, very typically people end up giving you a time around a day or so that they might try to work on some difficult problem. And what I point out here is that almost any really, really interesting, fun, difficult, important problem that you can imagine in our world takes much more than a day to solve it. They take months, years, sometimes decades if we're lucky, to solve the problem. And that does not make it that doesn't make it less worthwhile working on it. And in fact, those are some of the most fun, exciting problems to work on. Science has had the problem that if you want to solve really interesting problems, you have to be able to stick to a problem longer than a few hours or a day or so. And so the culture of science has developed an approach which I've been calling scientific optimism, which is this ability to perhaps fool yourself into thinking that you can solve a difficult problem long enough to solve it. And that means that you have to be able to inculcate and share this can-do spirit that allows you to stick to a problem. It comes along with some extra advantages, like you start to understand that you're not going to solve the problem in one master stroke at a time usually. Typically, you'll do iterations that you'll get a better solution and then a better one and a better one. And it's, I think, a much more fertile way of approaching these very big, difficult problems than to expect that you'll sit down and, in a day you'll describe the answer and then you'll tell everybody that how to solve the problem. I see this then as actually one of the contributions of science. Along with this can-do spirit, you get some extra advantages. Like I think you start to think of the world as a world where you can increase the pie, you can grow the resources that people can use, because you have this sense that problems are solvable, and that it's not a matter of solving problems by where one you've managed to have some group of people have some ability have some resources, and now it's not fair because other people don't have it. The scientific optimism, I think, allows you to say, let's make sure that resource is available to everybody, so that you're not in a position of having to take the resource away from one so that you can share it with the others. I think it's really important to have the possibility of making the whole world more capable and the whole world be able to have some resource and ability. So that's I think one of the goals of this kind of work. All right, so in a course like this, we have other aspects of can-do science that we teach and explain. Some are just the tricks of the trade that make it possible to approach these really big science, big questions. But perhaps the most important one to start with is that ability to trust that you will be able to solve the big problems. Let me turn to this right column of topics. So the left column is a lot of the rationality that we develop. The right column is what happens when humans try to use all this rationality. And this is where the social psychology was such an important part of this course. So if you ask, I think most of you by now will have seen the behavioral economics that you may have come across in the work of the book that was called Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman, where he was pointing out that we as humans use many standard rules of thumb, many heuristics, which help us for lots of purposes, but they also come along with mistakes that we very typically make when we try to approach problems. And so there are many of these human cognitive failings that we fall into. One of the perhaps most important ones that we discuss in this course, and there are many of them. We teach all about the different different biases that come in of different sorts. But one of the ones that I think is particularly important is this confirmation bias, and this is the bias that comes about because we have a real tendency to hunt for evidence and only incorporate new evidence when it supports something that we already believe. And of course, that's a terrible way to try to learn about the world. And so it's very important for us to be sensitized to the fact that we will often fall into that trap. Now, there's some classic ways in which scientists fall into that trap, and that we keep discovering new ways. And so one of the more interesting recent ones was the discovery of confirmation bias that you can see when you look through the history of the measurement of some important, let's say, the mass of some particle in physics. And what you find is that scientists, as the measurements get better, you don't see what you were hoped to see, which is that the measurements would bounce around, and then little by little they would start to narrow in on the correct answer. Instead, what you see is that people seem to get answers that look a lot like what they expected from the previous result for a long time, and then eventually somebody gets a much better technique and the answer moves suddenly. And what seems to be going on is something which is very human. You can very much understand it, which is that you're often in a position where it's very difficult to collect data for a problem and very difficult to analyze it, and you're having to do all that data collection and analysis in the face of a world in which people keep your students keep coming and saying they need to finish their thesis and they need to go to a conference to give a talk, or you need to go to the conference and give a talk and present the results. And so as a scientist, you're trying to make sure that there's no errors in your analysis and there's no bugs in your computer program that did the analysis. And yet, what you find is that your student, let's say, or your own presentation, they come and they show a graph. And the question is this graph ready for me to present at the next conference or ready for me to finish my thesis? And it's very, typical. You would look at the graph and you would say, well, that looks very strange. It's kind of goes off in the wrong direction here on the right. I bet there's a bug in your computer program, or I bet there's an error in how you selected which data you were going to use to put in this graph. You better go back and work on it some more. And the student goes back and they work on it some more, and they come back a few months later after 2 or 3 of these iterations, and they show you a graph, and it looks fine. It doesn't do anything surprising. It looks sort of like what you expect. And so you tempted at that point to say, okay, you can finish your thesis, or okay, go and show this at that next conference. But of course, that's a terrible way to decide when to stop looking for the bugs in the computer program or the errors, because that will almost guarantee that you'll always get the result that you expect, not the result that's really telling you what's going on out there in the world. Now, it's more likely that your expectation is true than that you get a surprise. The world isn't always giving you surprises every time you do an experiment, and so you can get away with it a lot of the time. But it doesn't actually do science. It doesn't allow you to learn something about the world. All it allows you to do is get the same graph that you expected to get. But this is something that if you look back in the science literature, you can see clear evidence that that's been going on over and over again in published papers. And so this became clear in physics now it's been 10, 20 years or so, that people started to realize that they have to do something to fix this problem. And so they developed an approach that is called blind analysis that is aimed at solving this problem. And the idea is that you have to avoid letting yourself see the consequence of your decisions about what the bugs in the computer program are, whether you made an incorrect selection of your data. You have to avoid letting yourself see the final graph that you will be biased to know what the answer is until you checked for all the bugs and checked for all of the selection effects and all the other problems in your science. And at that point, you allow yourself to see the answer. And just for the fun of it, I thought I should show you, how this showed up in my own field of cosmology, because we've started to use the blind analysis technique as well. And I'll begin by describing this measurement that people have tried to do for over a century now, which is the measurement of the expansion rate of the universe today. So how fast is the universe speeding up? In a different lecture, I'll explain to you, why it's possible for a universe to expand at all. But for the moment, just believe that the universe can expand and that we want to know how fast it's doing it. It's a very difficult measurement to make. The data bounced around terribly and was way off for the first half of the century, of the 20th century, and then started homing in to this region that was closer to what we think is the correct answer today. But there's something odd about the way it homed in that last 30 or so years. Let me zoom in on that area, and you'll see that it did not really start to solidify until the very end of the century. And there's something odd about the way the data presented itself during this earlier period. One group always got numbers around 100, and another group always got numbers around 50. And in fact, you could figure out which group was writing the paper just by seeing what the answer was. You didn't even have to look at the authors, on the list. And so it was a terrible way to do science. They were actually great scientists, both groups. And what was going on is that they were actually often looking at the same data sets and correctly identifying errors that the other group had made in their analysis. And so they were actually doing good work. The problem was that they were correctly identifying errors until they got the result that they expected. And then they would publish. And then the other group would correct the other group's errors until they got the result they expected. And of course, this holds up science. You don't actually get any good results for 30 years out of all this. And what was missing was this approach of blind analysis that I was describing. Nowadays, if you are making a plot with the data on it, and you have these different options of what the reality might be that I've shown you in these different colored lines, you don't let the computer show you the data on the actual line. Instead, you let the computer show it to you as all the different possible ways that it could be different from what you might expect, or the same as what you might expect. And you have to use those to decide when you're ready to unblind and let yourself see what the real data is showing. So you do all the debugging of your programs and all the debugging of your analysis without knowing the answer. And then you finally get to see the answer. And that's actually a kind of exciting moment nowadays in a project when you do the big reveal and you get to see, did I get an exciting result, or did I get just something that will be fine, but won't change anything important. We're trying now to start to spread this to other fields. And so this is a paper that I worked on with one of my colleagues who taught the course with, who's a social psychologist. And he wrote the paper with me to present this concept to social psychology, because there was a field where there was a real problem with reproducibility over the years, that people were having a hard time recognizing getting results that stood the test of time. All right, those are individual human cognitive failings. It gets even more difficult when you put groups of people together, and you know the problems of wisdom of crowd versus herd thinking. But what I want to focus on here is that what we spend a lot of time with in the end of the course is looking for mechanisms by which you can weave together the values, the emotions, the goals, the conflicts of interests, the fears that go into decision making with all of the rationality that we've taught in the first part of the course. And I think it's a very important thing for us to do if we want to develop the capability as a culture, as a society, to make rational decisions together, that we have to take it as our job to develop the principled approaches to weave these together. Because if you don't do it in a principled way, the stuff that gets left behind is all the rationality, not the values and the emotions and the goals, because those are what makes us human and makes us want to make a decision in the first place. And so in a course like this, we've been teaching different techniques that people have invented to weave these together in a careful way. One of the ones that I find particularly exciting is this technique called deliberative polling, where you bring a random sample of people together and they start to deliberate on a topic. And then when they get stuck, there's a panel of experts that they can ask questions of. And those experts don't agree with each other. They come from different points of view, but the group that's doing the deliberation then has to judge between the experts and figure out what do they really think about the matter. And I find it's a very optimistic experience to read and to see these deliberative polls in action, because it makes it seem quite possible that the actual people in our societies are able to think quite rationally when these when the whole behavior is scaffolded, when we have ways to work together that are principled and are organized. The final part of this course is this topic of when is science suspect. And I'm not going to go into it today, but I just want to call out the fact that it's really important that when you teach a course like this, we don't treat science as if it's a guarantee that you've done everything right. That we don't want people to think that just because we label something as scientific, it's doing well. There have been terrible times in history where people have used what seems to be science to do all sorts of oppressive, terrible things to each other. And we want to be on the lookout for that as well when we start talking about science as our tool. And similarly, there are lots of times in which what starts looking like a good science project ends up falling into all sorts of pathologies and pseudoscience. And you want to teach people to be on the lookout for that too, so that just because somebody claims that they're using science doesn't mean that they're getting the best of this whole culture approaching the world. And so we want to make sure that that's understood, and that people don't start to treat science as if it were just a magical ingredient that you throw in and suddenly everything's good. So that is in the end one of the important parts of the course. So finally, in the end, we have a vocabulary and a culture, and I will come back to this slide later to leave it up for a conversation with other ideas that one might want to teach. But I want to finish the talk by just asking the question: how can this vocabulary of scientific thinking make a difference? And what would we hope that a next generation of citizens would do differently if they had all learned the science-based critical thinking style and culture? Well, first, we hope that these next generation of citizens would understand how important it is that we share a realistic picture of the universe, how easy it is to fool ourselves and be mistaken. We'd like them to be using this probabilistic style of thinking so that they're able to change their minds when new data becomes available and not feel like it's somehow embarrassing to change your mind. That should actually be, they should be proud of changing their mind when the time comes. And perhaps most important, they should be using all this understanding of the tentativeness and fallibleness of our strength of our understanding as a strong motivation that they want to be part of group decision making, because they want to listen to what the others can tell and help them to see where they're going wrong. And I think that's it's such a surprising message, I think, from science, which is often seen as arrogant, that it's the one that teaches you why you need to listen to other people to help you figure out how we're making mistakes and where we're going wrong. I hope this next generation of citizens would understand that you want to iteratively improve our solutions, and that this can-do spirit will allow them to join decision-making with the expectation that they'll enlarge the pie for everybody. So they won't find themselves joining decision-making groups with the idea of fighting over the scraps from each other. And of course, what you really want is that they recognize experts, and that those experts are those people who, in fact, do all those things well. So it's the people that you want to trust as experts are the ones who come to a problem with a lot of that self-questioning, probabilistic thinking, and clear openness to what other people are telling them, and clear ability to change their minds, with this confidence that enlarging the pie will help solve the big problems. And I think that's going to be one of the real tricks, to get people to the point that they are looking for that in their experts. So in the end, I see these as the shared skills that we all need in order to be able to work together constructively. And it's not good enough just for the scientists to be trained in this, and not every scientist even is getting trained yet in this as effectively as I think they could be. That's why I think that it's really important that we learn a way of teaching this all together, because we need to, I can't do it by myself. I will make all the same mistakes. I need to have other people around me who will keep me honest in this respect. I think we can approach this, through the education in schools, universities, professional schools, online, and of course, today I call out the science museums for this. And I'm hoping that you can imagine what it would be like if someday we were all equipped with this toolkit to encounter the problems that we find through our lives. So let me make sure I stop now so there's enough time for conversation, and I will leave perhaps on the screen that list of ideas just for a few minutes if people have to be reminded if some of them have questions about others. So thank you, and I hope this provides a fertile beginning for its conversation.
Thank you very much, Saul, for your enlightening talk. I would like to ask the audience, if they wish to do so, to type. Please type your questions in the chat window. If you have any question or comment, thank you so much, Saul. In the meantime, while we wait for questions from the audience, I was wondering, listening to your talk and the idea of making rational decisions you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and all of these aspects, whether, as a control theorist, we are studying nowadays all these automatic ways of steering decision making, or steering decision, influencing the public, or influencing it's the opinion, if you want, influencing opinion, it's becoming a science in its own. And so I was wondering what is your opinion, your view about AI mechanisms that will actually become more and more powerful and become part of the conversation? Because you mentioned humans and human critical thinking, but I think more and more there will be a role that these automatic artificial intelligence systems will play. So what is your view about that?
Well, I think the automatic elements and the artificial intelligence actually highlight a number of these issues in a very interesting way. So first of all of the human cognitive failings that we're describing, all the biases, we've seen that some of the early AI, it gets trained on the humans. And so it's very easy for it to be trained on all of the same mistakes that the humans make. And of course, that's one of the first things to watch out for, that we don't just solidify the kinds of mistakes that we're currently making, or for that matter, solidify our misunderstandings of reality, of the world out there, and just build them in because we're training them into artificial intelligence. Now, let's imagine that we somehow in the long run get an artificial intelligence that can start learning things about the world without being trained by our mistakes. Even so, it then has many of the same problems that we're describing that a human has. So it has to be able to also, when you get to making a decision, it has to be able to help us do this weave of the values and the fears and the goals in with the rational elements. And of course, I think would be very reluctant to pass over any of that balancing act to the machines, unless machines, were able to be designed in some way that we would start to trust. So I think it in some ways it brings to the forefront many of the same issues in a very nice way that we're describing just for humans. You can almost see them more visibly when you put it outside ourselves into the artificial intelligence world.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I think for your answer, there is a question from the audience that I will read from you. It's from Lenida Vittoria Marinelli, and she's wondering whether your research group or you've been thinking about ways to overcome confirmation bias in research in the humanities. She mentions literature, history, philosophy. As she says, we do not have software to do blind analysis.
So I've been very interested in this question about what would happen if you used many of these same vocabulary of tools in the humanities. And it seems to me that one tradition I know that essay writing, for example, has slightly different traditions in different countries. But in the United States, when we're taught to write essays in school, generally the style is very much a sort of argumentative style, where what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to come up with something that you want to prove and then demonstrate why it's true in several different ways, with evidence drawn from perhaps what you're reading. And I think it would be very interesting to challenge the essayists to play the other game, to ask, let's first walk through let me show why saying might be true, but ask, suppose I had misunderstood how humans work. Suppose I misunderstood how this author worked. What would I be looking for that would tell me that I had made a mistake? And I think the exercise and the game of looking for the world, if it turned out that you were wrong about something, what would that world look like, and could I find evidence for it, is, I think, by itself a very interesting activity and very interesting game. And could be a fun way of approaching the humanities as well in this case. Now, obviously, some of these other topics I'm describing are clearly humanities issues. How do you deal with fears and goals and values in a complex world? And what do you do about it? And and there, of course, the idea of trying to feel comfortable bringing in all of the evidence of the scientific world as well, I think is a very important way for us to reintegrate the humanities and the sciences, where I feel like we've often separated them too far apart, and we've forgotten that we're all humans and we all do both things.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. There are many comments in the chat and many thanking you for your talk and your inspiring presentation. There is a colleague from Naples, Piero De Lellis, who asks whether you think social media and the way people interact within social media might be redesigned not to amplify our cognitive biases and to foster more constructive interactions and critical thinking in the masses.
Now, I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges for all of us in the upcoming years, because I think it's absolutely possible to design around these problems instead of designing just around making money by clicking advertisements and keeping people online long enough so that you capture their attention. I think that so far the internet has been used to do slightly random things, and it was aimed at commercial purposes, and so much effort was put into developing those capabilities. But there's no reason that you couldn't put just as much time and effort into developing the capabilities of scaffolding really interesting, exciting, fun, deliberative conversations where people actually make progress together and don't just yell at each other. The current scaffolding, I think, seems to be maximally designed to bring out the strongest, absolute zealots who are going to be convinced that they know the answers and to say it as loudly as they possibly can. But you can design systems that bring out other features of people, because I think people are complex, and we have parts of us that are, for every one of us, we have parts of us that are zealots, I'm being a zealot about this whole concept today of critical thinking. But we're also parts of us that are open to listening to other people's points of view and that are curious about what are other people thinking. And I think absolutely we should be now designing the most interesting, fun activities that you could do online that would bring out these capabilities of doing exactly what I'm talking about in this course.
Okay, thank you. So next we have a question from Ida Maiellaro, who asks, she's from the University of Bari, she's asked whether you think a probabilistic attitude could be introduced since primary school, or could it be misleading whether if you introduce it at such an early stage?
I think if you teach it correctly, it's never misleading, because I think it is the honest truth about our connection to reality and we're very comfortable with it in many scenarios. I mean, we all know that it may rain today, it may not rain today. Nobody gets really terribly offended if it turns out that they were wrong and it actually rained when it didn't rain. You feel like the world is probabilistic. Sometimes it does or it doesn't. And I think that if you teach it correctly with this understanding that sometimes you have a very strong confidence in something, what are the odds that this airplane will actually, these thousands of tons of weight are just going to take up and fly if I get onto this airplane? Well, it's 99.9999% likely. I can bet my life that I can get on an airplane and I will fly. And it doesn't mean that it's just because you're thinking about the world probabilistically doesn't mean that you can't be very sure about some things, and that you can't look to experts who will give you a lot of confidence that this vaccination is very safe, and it also will stop you from getting COVID-19, and that is no less certain if it's done correctly in somebody's mind than the certainty that they can get on an airplane and they can fly. And I think that if it's done right, I think people would be able to take it on at a much younger age. And I think they would understand it because we do this automatically for many purposes. I think we just need to recognize how it is that works and why it is that allows you to be less needy to be always right, that you can be always right about how well what your probabilities are, that you understand something. And that's much safer than always being right about the way the world is, because it means that you can change your mind. And if you say you're 90% sure of something, that means that 1 out of every 10 times you should be wrong. And that's what your ego should be invested in, not always being right.
Yes. Thank you. We have two somehow related questions. Let me try to put them together. One is by Giuseppe Sarracino and the other from Grazia Ballo, who is a PhD student in law at the University of Naples. And Giuseppe is asking whether you think it's actually possible and realistic to teach to the majority of the people the critical thinking that you described in the talk, which I think is related to your previous answer. While Grazia is also asking whether you have suggestions to bring people who are not from science closer to scientific knowledge, even in those areas that are far away from what they took courses on or graduated on. And she's working in criminal law, so she's wondering whether it is possible really to communicate, or if you want to teach these topics to people like her, and I guess to people who have a law background.
Well, I should say that the course that I'm describing, we've taught it now at Berkeley to over 6-7 years to students from all backgrounds. So these are students from humanities, social sciences, natural sciences. Some of them are in law school, some are going into law, some are going into business, and some into literature. And we found that actually, surprisingly enough, you can teach every one of these things with a lot of experiential learning. And my sense is that that all of these groups got just as much out of it as each other. And so I'm actually quite optimistic that you can teach these. We did not use almost any mathematics in teaching this. We often used examples that came from the ordinary day-to-day life rather than a science example. And so I think that it actually works quite well for all these groups, and I'm very optimistic. Right now, we're in fact working on converting this from the university level to the high school level, and I'm hoping that we'll go further with that. Similarly, I'm hoping to convert some of the course to things that can be taught in the law schools, the business schools, and the journalism schools, because I feel that many of these things would just be helpful to learn in those contexts.
Okay, thank you very much. There is also a comment and question from some members of staff at Città della Scienza who are asking, they say the motto of Città della Scienza as a museum is never stop asking yourself questions. So they ask, do you think the teaching method in schools today fulfills this motto?
I do think there's a problem with where we ended up teaching science nowadays, which is that because there's so many interesting things that you can teach, we start stuffing the students with they have to understand how to do chemistry experiments, and they have to understand how to do the Krebs cycle in biology, and they have to understand. And so there's so many things that we start to teach that it becomes a science starts to look as if it were a finished encyclopedia, and that all you need to do is have memorized the encyclopedia and you're doing science. And of course, that's so far from the day-to-day experience of being a scientist and it's much less fun than being a scientist. And I also think it loses a lot of what I'm describing here as the culture of science that could help you no matter whether you're going to be a scientist or not. So I am worried that we are not doing enough of that teaching of always asking questions, teaching all these different ways of thinking about our questions. And I think that would be, especially nowadays, when if you ever really want to learn something about chemistry, you can go look online and you can find the Khan Academy course and teach yourself something about chemistry. It's less important now to teach all of the the specific elements of any field than it is, I think, to teach the whole approach to thinking. Obviously, you want to teach some elements of the field just so people understand how you use that approach in a field. But I think you do much better with more of the elements that the question is asking about.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? If you have any question, please feel free to type it in the meeting chat. We have a few minutes still. We have another question from Deborah Vivo from Salerno, who's asking, what advice would you give to somebody who is struggling to work with people who are too convinced by their ideas and convictions that they won't listen to the message that you try to give?
I think there's a very important problem right now, and of course in the United States we've been forced to pay attention to this in just this last month, as we watch half of the country apparently not talking to the other half of the country and not able even to listen to each other's ideas. And so I've been asking, what things could we try to do that would help in these situations? And I'm imagining that one of the starting points is to try to use curiosity, to try to bring people to the table together with the curiosity about why could somebody else possibly believe the things that they believe, and not a need to convince them of something, not a need to convert them in any way, but more a chance to ask, okay, so what are the different pieces of the story that you believe that I would have to believe in order to share your point of view? In fact, I tried this out as a game with some other people who I don't understand their beliefs at all, and where we both just started asking each other, well, what is it that that we tried the topic of climate change? What are the different pieces of the story that you believe that if I believed that I would share your point of view? And I thought it was actually a very interesting exercise. I don't know whether that would reach everybody, and I imagine that part of the problem today is to begin just making everybody feel like there's a reason that they need to talk to each other, and that they want to convert the other side, so they have to ask each other questions. but I see this also as a very challenging problem. I'd like to see some activities online that were just fun for people to do, that made them want to come to the conversation, because I think that that might be one of the easiest ways to start the ball rolling.
Okay, no, thank you. So and the last question, I would say, because we're running out of time, is from Vittoria Maninelli, who's asking, in terms of the learning process, she was wondering what your opinion was on atomizing ideas, as Luhmann used to do, in order to create an open database of knowledge. So atomizing ideas, that's what she is suggesting. I hope I conveyed the...
Well, I should first admit the ignorance that I don't know of of Luhmann's particular suggestion. Now, I'm assuming that the concept is one of, and you'll have to correct me, is one of saying, can we start to just recognize each of the different pieces of ideas and build this larger database that people can use together? And I think that there's a strength in that and a weakness in that. So I think the strength is something that I've been thinking about in terms of, how would you like people to look at a newspaper article when they read it nowadays? What you might like them to do is to be able to think of it from all of the different ways that I've shown here in this vocabulary of critical thinking, one at a time, and just ask, does it do a good job with this? Does it do a good job with that? And by atomizing it, it means that you're able to recognize the different strengths and weaknesses. Similarly, it might make it possible to weave together new ideas by taking the different atomic pieces and combining them in unusual ways that don't ordinarily get combined together. So I think those are some of the strengths, that the ability to be able to separate out in that way and not to be stuck with a standard way of approaching everything, where everything falls into a standard linkage of how you approach a problem. Now, as the danger would be if the atomization is not woven together well, and if it becomes too hard for people to be able to find the next part of the story when it's needed. But I'd be I'd be curious to see how the proposals were being put together and whether they solve those problems well.
Okay, and maybe the very last question: what do you think Lucia Mortara asks about the time horizon of this process of changing the perspective in people? So she's wondering how much time it will take to get this through to a big mass of people.
Well, this ties back to my whole approach of being willing to take on a big problem and having the scientific optimism to stick with it long enough to solve the problem. And I think this is going to be first of all, in some sense, it's a forever problem that we constantly have to keep looking and finding ways to understand that we're going wrong and to do better together, and then to educate each other on whatever the new idea is that helps us to do this. I think that this immediate problem can we even teach these 24 ideas in a way that would help change perspective, is I think something that we would do slowly over 20 years of education for the next generation, but also we don't want to wait. So I think we take the attitude that we have to start working on underpinnings for all the schools to have this, and that will take 20 years to change schools and to start to educate people. But at the same time, we also start working at the other end, which is that we work in the science museums and we work in the professional schools, and we do online videos, and we start to see whether we can teach people even today, so that over the next year, a few more people feel comfortable taking the vaccinations for the pandemic. And I think every little bit that you do of teaching these styles of thinking makes a difference, because it doesn't take very many people to be modeling this behavior, I think, to affect how other people act. And so I think that we should do both. We should take the long-term view, and then we should be optimistic and try to teach and work with people as much as possible to change this perspective even now as we can.
Thank you, Saul. I think it will be good to close here with these words of optimism and hope. I would like to thank you again. Really, we are honored you were here with us today for giving such an enlightening and mind-opening talk. I renew our invitation to you to come to Naples and maybe to give this course in Italy, which I think would be fantastic if it could be exported also to other countries. I would like also to take this opportunity to thank the Regional Council of Campania that supported this event, the 7 universities located in our region. And last but not least, let me thank all the participants for attending in such a big numbers. I think teams got clogged at some point at the beginning of the talk because of the number of participants. Many have been attending the talk and listening to the talk via YouTube, Facebook, and all the other social channels. The talk was streamed too. So without any further delay, I would like to thank you, Saul, again for being with us today. And thank all the participants for attending this event. So we look forward to seeing all of you next year for the 35th edition of Futuro Remoto. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. It's a pleasure.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.